What does it mean to be feminine? Some people say that true femininity is softness. Others believe it is independence. Some associate it with dresses, long hair, and makeup. Others talk about an inner energy. And some are convinced that femininity doesn't exist at all, that it is something society invented. But that raises an important question. If no one can agree on what femininity actually is, why do millions of women keep searching for it? Today, there is an entire industry promising to teach women how to become more feminine. Courses, workshops, books, millions of views on YouTube. Yet, the more advice there is, the more women begin to feel that something is wrong with them. That's why I decided to turn not to the media or influencers, but to science. And the first thing that surprised me was this. Even in psychology, there is still no single scientific definition of femininity. Researchers have been studying this concept for decades, yet most studies are not about what a woman should be. Instead, they examine how society shapes our ideas of what a woman is supposed to be. If that's really the case, then one obvious question follows. Who decided what a woman should be? History offers a surprising answer: no one. Because every era created its own version of femininity. In ancient Greece, the ideal woman was modest and rarely took part in public life. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, fuller figures became the beauty ideal. They symbolized health, prosperity, and the ability to bear healthy children. Then came the Victorian era, when a tiny waist, impeccable manners, and emotional restraint became the standard. Women literally wore corsets that deformed their ribs and internal organs in order to fit the ideal. Just a few decades later, the rules changed again. In the 1920s, women cut their hair short, abandoned corsets, and began wearing clothes that had only recently been considered scandalous. The ideal changed again and again, yet each time society was convinced that it had finally discovered what a real woman was supposed to be. Historians call these social norms. They are never permanent. They emerge, evolve, and disappear along with society itself. And this applies not only to behavior. Ideals of height, weight, body shape, hairstyles, clothing, and even the facial expressions considered attractive have all changed over time. If you remove the dates and photographs, it becomes hard to believe that all of this refers to the same concept: femininity. But history reveals another fascinating pattern. Beauty ideals did not change by chance. They often reflected the economic conditions of their time. For example, during periods when food was scarce, women with fuller figures were considered more attractive. Their bodies signaled that their families had enough to eat and possessed resources. But as food became more accessible, the ideal gradually shifted. In the 20th and 21st centuries, slimness came to be associated not with poverty, but with the ability to choose high-quality food, exercise regularly, and invest time in one's health. What had once been seen as a sign of limited resources became a symbol of prosperity and well-being. The same pattern can be seen in skin tone. For centuries in Europe, fair skin was considered a symbol of high social status because it suggested that a person did not have to work under the scorching sun. But in the 20th century, when most people began spending their days in offices and factories, tanned skin unexpectedly became a symbol of wealth. It suggested that someone could afford vacations by the sea. Even clothing followed the same logic. High heels, long dresses, and corsets were often more than just fashion, they were displays of status. They restricted movement and made physical labor almost impossible. In other words, they signaled that the woman wearing them did not need to do hard work. This reveals something remarkable. Very often, the ideal was not what was natural, but what was rare, expensive, or inaccessible to most people. Perhaps beauty ideals were never only about women. Perhaps they have always reflected society itself, what it valued most in a particular era. And as society changed, so did its ideas of what the ideal woman should be. Perhaps something similar is happening today. In a world where many people constantly experience stress and a lack of time, what becomes attractive is not just physical appearance, but the image of someone who looks healthy, calm, free, and full of energy. Perhaps that is why the modern ideal is increasingly associated with being slim, physically fit, well-groomed, and emotionally resilient. We tend to believe that we are comparing ourselves to reality, but more often than not, we are comparing ourselves to society's idea of what a person is supposed to be right now. History shows that these ideas never remain the same, and yet each new generation accepts them as something natural and almost timeless. That is why we so easily begin measuring ourselves against the standards of our own time. And that leads to the next question. If ideals are constantly changing, why is it still so difficult for us to stop comparing ourselves to them? The answer lies in large part in the way our brains work. Human beings are social creatures. For most of our history, belonging to a group literally increased our chances of survival. As a result, our brains became highly sensitive to social approval and just as sensitive to the risk of rejection. That is why other people's opinions influence us far more than we like to believe. In 1954, psychologist Leon Festinger described the mechanism of social comparison. His idea was simple. People constantly evaluate themselves by comparing themselves to others. This mechanism helped us understand our place within the group and adapt to the people around us. Today, this mechanism is stronger than ever before. Every day, social media exposes us to thousands of carefully curated images of successful, beautiful, and seemingly perfect people. Our brains automatically begin using these images as a reference point. When we receive approval, the brain's reward systems, those associated with pleasure and motivation, become activated. That is why likes, compliments, and recognition can feel so rewarding. But there is another side to this. When we constantly seek validation from others, our self-esteem becomes dependent on their opinions. For the first time in history, people are no longer comparing themselves to dozens of others, but to thousands, even millions. And not to their real lives, but to the most polished versions of them. Modern research confirms that regular exposure to idealized content is associated with greater dissatisfaction with one's appearance and increased self-objectification, a psychological state in which people begin to see themselves through the eyes of others. A woman increasingly asks herself not, "How do I feel?" but, "Do I look good enough in the eyes of others?" Research shows that the more time people spend comparing themselves to idealized images, the more likely they are to feel dissatisfied not only with their appearance, but even with their lives. This affects both men and women, but women are more often faced with the expectation that their value is largely determined by how they look. This creates an interesting paradox. While an entire industry encourages women to become more feminine, modern psychology is increasingly pointing in a very different direction. Not toward learning how to fit an ideal, but toward letting go of other people's expectations and living authentically. Over the past few decades, researchers have increasingly concluded that long-term well-being is linked not to striving for an ideal, but to a sense of authenticity, living in alignment with one's own values rather than constantly trying to meet the expectations of others. Perhaps that is why the endless pursuit of the ideal woman so rarely brings lasting satisfaction, because as soon as one standard is achieved, society almost immediately presents a new one. History shows that beauty ideals inevitably change. What one era called beautiful, the next could see as strange, absurd, or even cruel. It is entirely possible that 100 years from now, people will look at our standards of beauty and femininity with the same sense of astonishment that we feel today when we look at corsets or the elaborate wigs of the 18th century. And if every era has repeatedly mistaken its own ideals of femininity for an eternal truth, perhaps it is time to stop searching for the ideal woman and finally allow women to simply be themselves.